All right, now we're recording. And this is Vicki. We're at DMA C102. We're going to talk about design principles, Chapter 2, Unity. So we're going to start by talking about harmony. When elements inside of an image look as though they belong together, you can think of them as harmonious. They have unity. There is unity in the piece. And over on the right, you can see a painting by Wayne Thiebaud, and it is of paint cans. There's unity in the shapes. There's unity in the colors used. It looks harmonious. Unity can exist, as it does here, with representational imagery, or it can exist with abstract forms. And what representational imagery means is simply that it looks like something that actually exists in our world. The way you create unity is by creating repetition. So you might use similar shapes, or you might use lines, repetitive lines. You might use pattern that's repeated, or colors that are used throughout the design. And whenever you do this, it creates these forms that are repetitive. So if you have a series of lines, as in this example, lines that are formed by the land that curve around, it creates a form. The lines create a form, the form of that land, and then that further enhances this feeling of that the image is unified. And here we have an example of a monochromatic image that uses color and all the variations of that color to enhance that sense of unity that's created by the other things. Again, artists plan and control. So when you are creating your design, you're going to think about how you can unify it. When we talk about composing or composition, we're talking about how all the elements are arranged or organized in a design. And we often can substitute those two words, composition, for design. When we talk about visual unity, you want to think about the whole. So the whole must be predominant over the parts. You see the whole pattern before you see the individual elements. And that is when you know you've created visual unity. Here's an example of some of the ways that artists or designers have created unity, and the different materials or methods that they've used. And this is a collage. So here we have an artist who's put together a variety of materials on a two-dimensional surface. But when we first glance at this, we do see unity, because all of those separate forms have spirals and curves and curls, and in some way relate to one another. So even though this is made up of individual artworks or compositions, the whole composition has unity. You can think of unity as being strictly visual or intellectual. So if elements have a common theme or concept, then they are said to have a unity of idea. So most of us have done some kind of a scrapbook page, and a scrapbook page is unified by the theme. Might be a trip you took, or a birthday that occurred, but not so much by visual composition. So you may not be thinking about how you're arranging the elements of that birthday party that you wanted to remember by putting it in your scrapbook, by how the invitation is placed on the page, and the little scrap of photograph and the confetti that came out of the piñata, whatever. So that it is unified, but it's unified by theme. Now, visual unity is when elements have some sort of similarity to the viewer's eye, so the viewer can zero in and find relationships. So there might be similar shapes, there might be similarities in size. And the designer is the person or persons that creates that unity for the viewer. The designer creates a pattern of similar shapes, lines, and or colors that helps organize the idea or intellectual unity into visual unity. So this is something to think about, Erin, in your work. If you're creating a pattern that's a visual pattern, then when you translate that to someone who can't see it, you might want to include the elements, the shapes, the lines, converging lines, or in some way verbally describe what you've created on the page to convey unity. A viewer doesn't come to the internet, a website, or a magazine page looking for visual organization, but we recognize it when we see it. And here's an example of a menu and how that's been created for visual interest, but there's also unity with color, there's unity in repetition, in the style of the numbers, even though those numbers vary in thickness and even color. There's enough relationships between them to create unity. And the color is continued over on the right-hand side in the text. When we talk about visual perception, we often need to talk about Gestalt, which is a theory of visual psychology, the study of perception. And your book goes into it a little bit more, but there, as a viewer, and you can see this, you can discern this in yourself, we tend to group objects that are close to one another into a larger unit. We tend to group like objects, and we also look for organization in the empty space. And I think we'll have some examples coming up here. So when we look at this example, we start to see, we see the small rectangles that are very close together as being part of a larger rectangle, as belonging together. Their sides touch, they're in close proximity to one another. The larger shapes on the bottom, we tend to group on the bottom right, and then we tend to group the ones on the upper left as sort of having some kind of relationship. But then we also see that white diagonal, and it's just as obvious to us, that white diagonal, as the two groups of similar shapes. So we look at this, we see the whole thing, and then we start to look for relationships and try to create some kind of order out of this. And we see the two groups, and we see the white line running towards it. And maybe even your mind starts to wonder, oh, what is this? Is it like a representation of buildings on a street? Or, you start to kind of think about the design. So when we look at something, and I'm sure that you've in your youth saw lots of kind of visual puzzles, but our brain immediately looks for similar objects, and we'll group those together, and then we'll try to make those into something else. So here we have, we see a bunch of squares. So immediately we group them into a horizontal line and a vertical line, and then we take that whole thing and make it into a cross. And it's all happening in our brain. Like there's no text on the page saying, you know, this is a cross in the middle of the page, and it's surrounded by squares of circles. But that's what we see. You might describe it differently, but you're probably seeing something very similar. So there are some different ways to achieve unity. If you want to make separate elements look like they belong together, put them close together. And that's probably one of the simplest ways that you can achieve unity. We use proximity when we type out words. So if you were to just type out a bunch of letters on a page without spacing, it would be very difficult to read individual words. And the same thing if you put them really far apart. You can repeat elements to create unity or harmony. And you can repeat them even if they're not the same size. If they just have a similar shape that is repeated, you can add variety with changing the size or maybe slightly changing the color, but you're still getting a feeling of harmony or unity. And you can see here that there's unity in color, there's unity in size. So first of all, there's unity in shape. All of these shapes are the same. But then there's smaller elements of unity. The smaller shapes share the same color. The larger shapes share the same color. And they all have the same texture. There's variety in the angles of these, but there are some that are sort of aligned in the same direction. So there's both visual interest in this composition, but there's also unity. And you want to achieve both, because unity can cross over the line into boring. If all those shapes were exactly the same size and oriented exactly the same way, it could be sort of a boring composition. And so here's another much simpler example of how the artist has simply used alignment and angle to create a number, but there's also a lot of unity between these shapes. And they're close together. So the reason we want unity is because we want a viewer to linger in our compositions for a while. And if we can keep the eye moving around the composition and sort of direct the eye, we create what's called a visual path. And as long as sort of the goal is to create a visual path that keeps the viewer in the picture and moving around it so that he or she sees all of the different elements. So you can, if you kind of look at this one, you can see the different ways that the limbs of the girls and their bodies take you from the bottom right up the leg of the girl who's reclining on the sofa, across her arm and the back of the sofa, past the fruit, maybe over to the piano, and the decorative leg of the piano leading us back to the first girl who's on the floor. So that way the viewer is absorbing the entire composition. And there is unity in the shapes, so the shape of the leg, the shape of the second girl's leg, even the shape of the arm, how it's slightly rounded and tapering down, the back of the sofa and the shape of the piano leg. There's unity, the repetition of the panels in the background. Everything is holding together and not shooting the viewer's eye off that composition. You can make continuation subtle, or you can make it deliberate. And it can be used in not only two-dimensional design like that painting we just looked at, but also three-dimensional or functional design. So in this car, you've got this, the shape in the door, and the front side panel continues up the windshield and probably across the convertible top, should that top be closed, and then leads us back around the whole outer shape of that car. So we use like unity and line and implied line in architecture, in functional design, like car design, in purely decorative paintings, things like that, even jewelry, everything. So you just use anything, a line, an edge, or a direction that something is pointing to carry the viewer's eye from one form to another, so that they stay in your creation for a longer amount of time. The visual path keeps them there. Sometimes you can organize your work by using a grid. And as web designers, we no longer, web design has moved well past grids and tables and things like that, but we still base our design on the grid in order to have continuity and unity and harmony between pages of a website or pages of a magazine. So I often ask people in this class to set up a simple grid in Photoshop that they can use to arrange their text and their images on, that, and their borders that can be duplicated for additional pages of the website or additional pages of the brochure or whatever you're designing. And you can find this if you just go pull out a magazine or a book. You'll see that the designer has used, in fact, our design text has, a gray rectangle at the top of every page that continues through the book. It contains the chapter name and the same size border on the edges of the page. Everything is laid out according to a grid. So we're often asked to design multiple units as a whole. So that's called serial design. And if you're going to do that, you need to understand how to create unity. Even though you might be designing a business card and a letterhead and a website banner, how can you create those so that the viewer knows that all these different designs relate to one another? So it's very closely related to the idea of branding. You want to use the same colors, you want to use the same shapes, the same fonts. You want to design serial design so that everything is related. There's unity across your design. And then, as I said earlier, the grid is still a very important part of designing websites. And here's just an example that's definitely designed on a grid, but has a very modern look thanks to the sort of droplets instead of rectangles and the rounded corners and things like that. You can have unity with variety. It doesn't have to be boring. Even the grid doesn't make it boring. So this is a design based on a grid, but there's overlapping and there's additional design elements like kind of a brush stroke of paint that relates one collaged element to another. And each individual design is unique. But when we look at this, we see unity because they're basically all rectangles. And we see unity in color. And then we have variety and interest in all of the smaller detail. You see potters, ceramicists who have used variety in a very wonderful way. They may repeat the same basic idea. You know, potter may really love this form with the very narrow spout at the top or tip, and kind of a sinuous flow and kind of a bulbous, you know, center, bottom center. But there's variety in the way that the artist has interpreted this. So there's repetition through all of her work, there's unity through all of her work, but there's also a lot of variety because we want to keep people buying those things. So some things that you can do to create unity, but you can vary, would be curves, columns, size, and shapes. And the rules in design are not rigid on the use of unity and variety. There are just so many different ways to achieve them. All you have to do really is start experimenting. And again, that's where critique comes in. You want to think about how you know, when you throw your draft up on the discussion forum, does the viewer just clicking on your piece see enough unity, or does it look like a lot of disparate elements that have just been thrown together? And if so, how could you unite, how could you create some harmony and unity in that design? Here we have a very bold example of unity through repetition. We have the twins, and they're wearing the same clothes, and they have the same expression, their hair is styled the same, very not boring, because you're trying to find differences in those two little girls, but very unified. And then you can use variety in the form that you're creating, the size, the color, the gesture. This painting has a lot of variety in it, in color and in shape, but there's enough similarities in the shape, and there's proximity. Shapes are often, I think all of them are touching each other, so that helps create unity in this. And here's another great example of variety. So this looks, at first glance, it looks kind of, you know, chaotic, but it is, you know, the colors are unifying it. The items being in really close proximity. Our eye sees all of this, puts it together as sort of a cross. So we understand intuitively, thanks to the way that the designer has put all this together, that everything here belongs and everything is a part of this design. If you don't have unity, an image or a design can become chaotic and unreadable. But without variety, your image is going to be lifeless and dull and uninteresting. So you have to find that good balance of both. Here we have an example of just jumble. You know, it's a photograph. It could be really effective, but we don't know what, if any, message there is here. It's just a jumble of shapes, and they're not really unified. The ones on the right, we see that group together, but then there's the ones on the left, and then they're all broken up by these vertical lines, and we just don't know quite where to look or where the really important part of this photograph is, so it just becomes meaningless. You can't really focus on anything. We're a little overloaded here. And then here's the complete opposite, you know, I mean, here we have there's nothing that stands out in this photograph. It's very repetitive. You might say it's kind of calming, but it's also kind of dull and uninteresting. It just, you know, if one house, if the photographer had found one house that really stood out, he or she could have made this, you know, a little more interesting to the viewer. And then you also see unity. It doesn't, you know, it extends definitely off the page. Sydney Leicht is an artist that is interviewed quite a bit in our MindTap version of this book. And she talks about unity and how she uses, she paints cardboard boxes, but how she achieves unity in these, with these cardboard boxes using color, shape, proximity, but also there's variety because they overlap. They're not just sitting flat one on top of the other. There's shadows. I recognize that Kleenex box down there. And then the unity is used by set designers and people who work in film. So there's a lot of unity here. We know who's related in this scene and who is not related. The not related person, everybody is seated in close proximity, but there is a person who stands separately. The related colors are all this kind of warm colors. The unrelated person is in cool colors. So very subtle, but along with whatever dialogue is going on and whatever else is happening in the scene, they create a very, you know, clear message. There's a group of unified people with one person, one outsider. And appreciation of unity is a simple and immediate sense of connections that resonate throughout a composition. And that's what the designer strives for. I'll stop sharing and I'll stop recording. And that